In today's world, we're being bombarded by well over 100,000 chemicals used in industry to manufacture the products that we buy, we eat, and the cars we drive, and things like that. And only about 10% of the 100,000 chemicals that are in use have ever been tested for human safety. And out of those, only about 1% have been tested at any kind of combinations. In the state of California, even, we have Prop 65, which identifies well over 900 chemicals known to cause cancer, birth defects, and other reproductive harm. While our livers are able to detox water-soluble toxins, the reality is that the synthetic chemicals and persistent organic pollutants are a recent development. Our bodies have not fully adapted to these materials, and they wind up becoming sequestered in fat. And our brains are 60 to 70% fat, but not all of that is adipose tissues. This graphic represents some of the more common toxic body burden symptoms that people may experience. These include blurred vision, memory loss, acid reflux and GERD, central nervous system disorders, increased risk of breast cancer, unexplained weight gain, back pain, low testosterone in men, irritable bowel syndrome, joint inflammation and stiffness, or increased risk of colon cancer. Now, in our fat, we have what are called triglycerides, that orange section, and then mitochondria that produce ATP, or adenosine triphosphate energy. Now, our mitochondria are known as the powerhouses, and the triglycerides become the fuel. So once the triglycerides are broken down into component parts of glycerol and fatty acids, they are able to then feed the mitochondria the fuel they need. Now, when the toxins enter the cells, they have a way of disrupting the processes that are needed for mitochondria to produce ATP. This includes oxidative stress as well as the disruption of the enzymes and proteins that are needed to help with the fueling of the mitochondria. As we see, mitochondria is a target of environmental toxicants. Mitochondrial dysfunction is a hallmark of environmental injury or toxicants. This roll-up of peer-reviewed literature just shows more about chemical exposures and how it relates to mitochondrial dysfunction. But mitochondrial dysfunction is the root cause of many non-communicable and non-genetic diseases. Chronic fatigue syndrome, for example. But here's a roll-up of several diseases that are known to be caused by environmental toxicants. These include autism, ALS, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and diabetes. I go on to say fibromyalgia, asthma, multiple sclerosis, and many other diseases that have no known etiology, that are not communicable or non-genetic. Our solution is called Sauna Detoxification Using Niacin, also known as Detoxination. Now, we have several goals for our detoxification program. First, it must address lipophilic xenobiotics. These are substances that are foreign to the body, that are fat-attracted or fat-soluble. It must liberate fat-stored xenobiotics at the cellular level. It must mobilize xenobiotics to the largest detox organ of the body, the skin, which makes up about 22 square feet. It must pick up xenobiotics in the GI tract and from bile acids that circulate from the liver, carrying toxins that the liver could not process. It must keep pace with the elimination of liberated toxins. It also must support the liver and kidneys. Detoxination is our answer. What is detoxination? Well, it's a concatenation of detoxification and decontamination. It was pioneered by my father, Dr. David E. Root, back in 1982 for Occupational Medicine. He used it to treat workplace exposure injuries, like the Shreveport firefighters fighting a transformer fire at the University of Shreveport, the 9/11 first responders, the Utah meth cops, and capacitor workers from a Semich, Slovenia capacitor plant exposed to PCBs. He's also used it to treat industrial accidents like Chernobyl and the contaminated water supply in Flint, Michigan. It's also been used for military service to treat Agent Orange, Gulf War syndrome, burn pit exposures, also explosives and other contaminations, including radiation. It started out as a drug addiction rehabilitation program to treat LSD, marijuana, pharmaceutical misuse, and other types of drugs. But who is Dr. David E. Root? Colonel David E. Root, MD, MPH, retired, served 20 years in the United States Air Force as a flying physician. He was an astronaut trainee for the Manned Orbiting Laboratory that was a top secret military space program. It never did take off. In fact, it was moved to NASA, but as a flight surgeon, his job would have been to take care of the other astronauts that were spying on the Soviet Union. He was then assigned as the flight surgeon at Beale Air Force Base to service the SR-71 squadrons, both the flight and ground crews. Now, if you don't know anything about the SR-71 Blackbird, just picture what Batman would fly like you see in these images. This is when we were able to actually go to the flight line to watch it take off and land. But you'll notice the T-38 has my father at the helm. He was also a chase plane pilot. So if a SR-71 Blackbird may have had problems getting the gears locked or they weren't sure, he would go up and make sure that the gear was locked and ready to land. He was also a research pilot physician for the military. He became an RAF exchange officer for the Institute of Aviation Medicine at Farnborough in England. This was a plane that was specially modified so that he can do in-flight medical research of chemical and biological defense systems. He's the only American doctor awarded the Queen's Commendation for Valuable Service in the Air. And he's also elected a Fellow of the Royal Aeronautical Society. He's the only American doctor pilot to be ever elected to this honorable role. He's also elected Fellow of the Aerospace Medical Association as well as the American College of Occupational and Environmental Medicine. This Wikipedia page shows that he's known for human detoxification. So how did he get started in detoxification? Well, it had a lot to do with the Blackbird. As you can see, the SR-71 Blackbird actually was designed to leak fuel while sitting on the ground, but then at high altitude, high temperature, and high speed, it would actually seal up. The titanium plates were designed to actually seal up, but leak while the plane was on the ground. In fact, whenever they took the SR-71 to an air show, they always told the local maintenance and fire department people that if the aircraft is not leaking fuel, then we have a problem. But it did have just enough fuel to take off and then refuel with the tanker before taking on its mission. Now you'll notice in this image that the ground crews are wearing rain ponchos because that was the best thing they could come up with to help protect these crews from the exotic JP7 fuel as well as the solvents and oils that this plane used. The problem was they were coming down with all kinds of diseases, and there was nothing in the medical literature to help my father to detox these poor ground crews that were basically getting ill from all of the contamination. To this day, there is nothing in the medical literature besides what we've published on how to detox chemicals and radiation. Of course, we do have heavy metal chelation, but for the most part, chemicals in our environment and from the products we purchase are actually as toxic, if not even more so. Now, back in 1981, he opened up his practice as an occupational and industrial medicine and general practice. He later switched completely over to Sacramento Occupational Medical Group, which was fully into occupational and industrial medicine. The index case for detoxification started with two painters who had been inside of a 650,000-gallon water tank painting the interior without any personal protective equipment, and there was only a small hatch at the bottom that was allowing airflow. So these painters were exposed to the fumes as well as the paint solvents while inside of this 650,000-gallon water tank. Now this is not the actual photo, but it's a good representation. Now, serendipitously at that time, because there was nothing he could do to treat them, he did receive a brochure from a company called Body Pure that had niacin exercise and sauna for drug addiction rehab. But at the time, he wasn't really interested in the drug addiction aspect, and so he thought this sounded kind of hokey anyway, and he threw it in the trash can. But he was thinking about the word sauna because the saunas have been in our lives since the 70s. In fact, this is our sauna from our Tahoe house, and I've been using saunas since I was 10 years old. So that word sauna got his attention, and he was essentially intrigued enough to contact them because they must be detoxing drug residues with saunas. So curiosity got the best of him, and he picked up that brochure and called the company and met with them on a Friday Turns out they were a splinter group of Scientologists that had brought L. Ron Hubbard's purification rundown to the public. Now, be aware, we have no association or affiliation with the Church of Scientology, but they gave him a 4-inch thick binder full of medical literature that explained why their protocol was so effective at drug addiction. And they allowed him to take this binder home. In fact, this is the exact same one. And he read through that and found that their program actually had validity. So he started sending patients like those painters to their center and got pretty decent results. In fact, he started sending more and more patients to their center and then realized that he ought to incorporate this into his practice. So they moved into the same building that he was in at the time, across the hall, and they opened up their drug addiction rehab center, and he became their Christian medical director, and they became his management team. So what is sauna detoxification using niacin? Well, it uses niacin as a catalyst for 2 actions in the body that help liberate toxins and mobilize them to the dermal regions. Now, most people are familiar with the flush, but niacin induces a secondary effect that's called rebound lipolysis, and I'm going to explain that in just a little bit. We use exercise to help mobilize liberated toxins to the dermal layers, the skin layers, where they can then be sweated out in sauna. But we also need you to understand that we're not sweating these toxins out through your watery eccrine sweat, and I'm going to explain that in just a little bit too. And then binders pick up toxins in the GI tract that can come from your food. They can permeate the GI tract lining while mobilized, as well as the bile acids coming from the gallbladder through the liver, which are used to break down fats, but also the bile acids pick up the toxins the liver cannot process, and those get picked up by the binders as well. Now, we do sweat out the good stuff with the bad, so we must replenish minerals and vitamins, and also we have oils, lecithin, and electrolytes that are used to help maintain the body's mineralization and nutrient levels. So digging further deeper into the science behind detoxination, we must first just understand what the flush is. So the capillary walls contain prostaglandin PGD2 hormones, and when you take niacin, they get released and they actually relax the capillary walls and allow a lot more red blood cells to flow through. These red blood cells then push bloodborne toxins out to the dermal regions where we can sweat them out. And if you've never done a niacin flush, here's an example of what I looked like when I did a 20-minute niacin flush, and I recorded every 5 minutes an image. So here you can clearly see that I am turning a bright shade of red, and this is because of the additional red blood cells flowing out towards the skin layers, and it's quite pronounced. It also is accompanied by a itchy, prickly sensation, which is caused by histamines. But after a short period of our program, you will stop doing a flush because the prostaglandin hormones will start to deplete from the cells and the flush will no longer happen for most people. Now, this secondary effect that I've mentioned is called rebound lipolysis. And this is a study that we found in 2014 that actually changed the dynamics of the timing of our program dramatically. We used to have a study that was done on sheep, and we didn't realize that was a sheep study that showed this effect occurring within 50 minutes. So now that we have human studies, in fact, this one was done by Wang et al. Back in 2000, we now understand the pharmacokinetics of niacin and how the niacin actually works for our program. What you're seeing here is a study done on women that was a glucose study. It had nothing to do with the detox program, but it was able to show how niacin interacts with the body. So what you're seeing are the free fatty acid concentrations in the blood plasma over a 6-hour period with measurements taken every 30 minutes. The control group and the study group were the same group of women. They just came back months later to complete the study. As the control group, you can see that they had a pretty flat line level of free fatty acids in the blood plasma over that 6 hours. And what you're seeing is a representation of what's called lipolysis. So lipolysis is the breakdown of triglycerides into the glycerol and 3 fatty acids, like I mentioned earlier. And then whenever you're producing ATP, you are also liberating these free fatty acids from the fat cells to go populate the cells that also produce energy. And then during that period, there's a siphoning effect of the toxins that may be stored in the fat cells. So there's a little bit of a liberation of toxins from fat during this period. But when a person is taking niacin, it has this effect of inhibiting or depressing the ability to produce ATP for the entire time that it takes for niacin to metabolize. Niacin has a half-life of 20 to 45 minutes, so it takes approximately 5.5 half-lives for niacin to wear off. And while it's wearing off, the body is able to resume the lipolysis cycle. However, it tends to overshoot, and this is called rebound lipolysis. And what you're seeing here is about 4 times the normal levels of free fatty acids, which then translates to about 3 times normal liberation of xenobiotics from the fat cells. This is the time that we exploit for exercise and sauna. Now, the exercise is a low-impact aerobic exercise, and it's only intended to get the heart rate back up so that you're pumping these toxins out to the dermal regions where they can then be sweated out. And then the sauna is a total of 75 minutes in an infrared sauna. We can go up to 90 minutes or 2 hours in a dry sauna because of the oppressively hot nature of dry saunas, where you may have to spend 15 to 20 minutes before cooling down for 5 to 10. So there's a lot of repeated cycles of heating and cooling. So the far infrared saunas are much more desirable because they can actually produce a much greater sebaceous sweat in a very short period of time at lower temperatures. So this is the time that we are in the program itself each day. So let's talk about the types of sweat that our bodies produce. There's 3 different kinds of sweat. We have the eccrine watery sweat glands, the apocrine sweat glands, and then there's sweat glands that are attached to the genitalia, which we don't really need to discuss here, but just know that the watery eccrine or perspiration type sweat is not going to produce any kind of toxic elimination because these are lipophilic toxins. They're fat attracted or fat soluble, and they really don't go anywhere near water. They're hydrophobic. So the way that we sweat toxins out that are lipophilic is through what's called sebaceous sweat, and that is produced by the sebum in the sebaceous glands. And the sebum is actually keeping the hair follicle lubricated and the skin and hair moist on the surface while providing a barrier against bacteria and other types of toxins, but literally not from air pollution or anything like that. So the sebaceous sweat is produced in an infrared sauna much more effectively, and that's why we've switched from dry saunas to infrared. So this is the graphic I mentioned earlier where we had a study that was done on sheep that indicated that this rebound occurs after about 40 to 50 minutes. So once we discovered that humans trigger this rebound lipolysis after about 3 hours, we realized that we were literally wasting the first 3 hours of the person's day on the original Hubbard method. This reduced the total commitment from 4.5 to 5 hours a day down to just 2. Let's talk about some case studies. This first study was done on a woman who was an inspector for the capacitor plant in Summit, Slovenia, whose job it was to barehandedly pick up capacitors that came down the conveyor belt and see if they leaked PCBs. If they did, they went into the bad bucket. If they didn't, they went into the good bucket. Now, we've talked about how the sebum produces a barrier for contaminations, but however, the hands and feet don't have these sebaceous glands. So she was absorbing all these PCBs into her bare hands, and it caused her to become violently ill, where she was actually sleeping 20 hours out of the day, useless the remaining 4 hours, and her breasts were oozing 50 cc's of a bluish-green material, which was identified as PCBs. So after the 5th day of her program, her discharge ceased, as well as after the program, she was able to return to work. 11 other capacitor workers were also put through the program, and they had incredible results because this particular study actually was one that has shocked the toxicology world. They found when they did the fat biopsies, which was the only way we could actually do studies to show a pre and post detoxification, They literally had to take 6-inch biopsy needles and shove them into the rumps of these patients to get the pre and post detox samples. These samples were then sent to university labs, and what they found when they compared the fat content of PCBs to the blood serum were the fact that the fat content was 200 times greater than the blood serum tests revealed. So this study has been cited in 25 other papers, as well as it has been cited in a medical allergy textbook. Dr. George Yu, another name associated with this program, is a colleague and was also instrumental in helping through several programs that you're about to see, as well as he decided to do his own studies with his patients. Now, he's a urology surgeon, and his testing of patients' fat and blood comparisons showed that the PCBs and DDE, which is a metabolite of DDT, were 1,000 times greater than the blood tests revealed. This next study of 14 firemen exposed to PCBs in a transformer fire at the University of Shreveport had enough data to actually produce this paper, but the project itself got shut down. Apparently, a consultant hired by the city of Shreveport went to Los Angeles where the project was being conducted and found that it was run by a group of Scientologists. So he went back and reported that the optics weren't going to be good, so they wound up shutting this project down. This ultimately led to a probe being opened by the state of California Medical Board. And what they found after my father submitted a 50-page response letter that contained 23 pages of cited literature was that this program itself had merit. And so they allowed him to carry on using this program, as well as the state of California became his largest client. The next project I want to talk about is the New York Rescue Workers Detoxification Project that ran from 2002 to 2007 and ultimately treated over 5,000 first responders, volunteers, and civilians that were involved with the cleanup efforts at Ground Zero. Now, my father is an advisory board member for the Heroes Health Fund, which ultimately funded this project, so none of the 5,000 of the project participants ever paid to go through it. This was a pilot project here in Sacramento that occurred in 2002 prior to the actual project starting up in New York. We moved everything from the Sacramento Occupational Medical Group Center to New York and opened up 2 centers in Manhattan. So you can see this group of firefighters are sitting in a tiled sauna that was a dry sauna. Now, there were unprecedented exposures based on all the particulate matter that came down with the buildings. And one of our clients actually was involved in that cloud. She actually stepped out of her office into the cloud and her lungs became overwhelmed to the point where she had less than 20% capacity remaining in one lung. Now, Dr. James Dahlgren has described the toxic dust and fumes and vapors that arose from the collapsing World Trade Center to contain all types of chemicals, including dioxins, PCBs, asbestos, silica, benzene, polybrominated diphenyl ethers, manganese, chromium, lead, mercury, nickel, oxides of nitrogen, and sulfur. And this slide represents the populations with the heaviest exposures. But the standard of care treatment involved inhalers, steroids, acid reflux medications, and antidepressants. The goals of their treatment were just to suppress symptoms because they expected that time will heal. But our project goals included rescue workers return to their pre-9/11 quality of life, the rescue workers retained in the workforce and not facing forced or early retirement, and the prevention of long-term effects resulting from body burdens of toxic chemicals. As I mentioned, over 5,000 rescue workers and other residents were treated from 2002 to 2007. And here's an example of the types of staining we would see on towels. In this particular case, this first responder was showing morbidly high levels of manganese that were being excreted from his sweat. Now, these next 4 slides, I'm going to let you pause and read through because there's a lot of information here, but these are all success stories. So the study involved 484 of the participants. 273 of these were firefighters, 52 were sanitation workers, 19 paramedics, 23 police officers, and 117 citizens who were volunteers at the cleanup. Now, based on the RAND short form 36 question questionnaire, this is a chart representing the symptom severity scores pre and post detox. Now, many of these folks had thyroid conditions. In fact, 30% of all the patients had some kind of abnormal levels of thyroid-related hormones. After treatment, 66% of these patients were back to normal thyroid function. Now, before treatment, 50% of these patients had high cholesterol, and 70% had ideal levels of LDL. As you can see in this graphic, that 42% of all patients had to have some form of medications, whereas at the end of treatment, 87% of these patients no longer required medication. And then after their program, you can see they had quite the improved quality of life. This was one of several studies that were produced on this particular project. Now, this is the woman I mentioned earlier who stepped into that cloud of dust that was coming down the streets of Manhattan. She had stepped out of her office building and right into that cloud, and her lungs became so incapacitated that her doctor told her to go home and take care of her affairs because she wasn't going to make it. Fortunately for her, a friend mentioned this detox program, and she found the center, but they turned her away initially because they figured that their insurance wasn't going to be able to cover a potential loss of her life. But she wound up meeting my father, and he took her under his wing, and he put her through the program, and I believe she ran 55 days on this program. And as you can see, at 60, she looks a heck of a lot better. And in fact, her story is so interesting that Dr. Daniel Amen and his wife Tana had us on the Brain Warriors Way podcast to discuss her case in the treatment program. You can find that on his podcasts. The next study is the Utah Meth Cops Project. Now, based on the results of the New York Rescue Workers Detoxification Project, the then Attorney General for the state of Utah, Mark Shurtleff, funded a project for 68 meth cops. Now, these meth cops, when they bust the meth labs, are exposed to all of the solvents and chemicals used in the manufacturing of meth in the melees. So basically, these folks were substantially affected by the medical conditions that these toxins did result in. And several people did die. So there were some common symptoms seen with these meth-exposed officers, including significant debilitating fatigue, heartburn, severe insomnia, headaches, irritability, muscle spasms and joint pain, variable numbness of the hands and feet. So the Meth Cops Project was funded in 2007 and treated 68 police officers, and their programs ran for 30 to 35 days on average, and the average reduction in symptom scores was 72%. This was also a published study. Here's an example of the types of towels I've seen with meth cops. Now, this is not one of the Utah meth cops, but he came in from New York based on that study. His meth raids involved over 180 meth labs, and his body was producing very colorful stains. Some days they'd be just tan, other days they'd be this bluish purple, and then like this one we call the tie-dye towel, he would have plenty of these towels. And we did discover that the bluish purple material in his case was actually Drano, or sodium hydroxide. There was a Gulf War syndrome study that was done recently. In fact, the study results just came out in 2019. The study involved 32 participants, and they were divided into two groups. The 22 were actually the treatment group, and 10 were in the control group. Now, the treatment group did show significant improvements in health and their quality of life measures. And the detox protocol was basically, it did result in about 6.9 points in a PCS score, which is actually part of the RAND short form 36 health survey. This was also a study that was published. Here's a list of additional peer-reviewed studies that you can find on the internet. Now, I want to talk about testing because in the case of the pre and post detox, there are very few ways people can actually do a pre-body burden and post-body burden without having fat biopsies. So the types of testing that we have available include urine and stool, which are both going to show what the body is eliminating at any given time, not necessarily the body burdens. The blood will show what's in the blood at the site of the draw at that given time. Not good, again, for any pre or post detox. Hair samples or HTMA testing is not very reliable. They're easily contaminated. Bioresonance devices we've tried, they don't really do anything but show us what the body's toxic with. So the only way we were able to do the studies was using fat biopsies. And one other thing we found is that the detoxination program resets the metabolism and the body continues to detox even after a 30-day program. Here is a study that was showing that the body burden reductions continued for 4 months after a 30-day program. So this was pretty interesting to see that the body continues to detox. Now, as you can see there, the deodorant is not going to come out very readily, and that's because it is extremely toxic, and that's why it's banned, and yet it still persists in the environment, and people do show up with that as well as DDT. So, a summary of sauna detoxification. It is 100% holistic and non-invasive. Thousands of occupational and environmental exposure cases have been successfully treated worldwide. There's over a 30-year history of peer-reviewed published research that continues to the present. The State of California Medical Board approved it for occupational medicine in 1987, and I rolled it out to the public in 2017 for health and wellness with the publication of our book, and it does improve outcomes in less time. As for me, my name is Daniel Root, and I've been married to my wife Susie for 33 years. I'm the adoptive father of 3 beautiful biological sisters, and I was on the board of Sierra Adoption Services. We changed the name to Sierra Forever Families. I was on the board for 6 years. I've been an IT entrepreneur for 35 years. I am now the CEO of Saberhawk LLC in Rancho Cordova. I hosted the Get Detoxinated show on 105.5 FM. I am the co-developer of Detoxination. I am known as the Senior Detoxinician. I also train others to do what I do. I have a detoxination training program. And I'm also the author of Sauna Detoxification Using Niacin, following the recommended protocol of Dr. David E. Root, which is available on Amazon. I also run a Facebook group called Detoxination, which can be found if you just type in Sauna Detoxification Using Niacin. So how can I serve you? Well, I do consulting, and that means program implementation, sauna acquisition, because there's a lot of different styles of sauna out there, and they're good ones and they're bad ones, and I can help you to find the right sauna for the need. In fact, for the budget too. I do general consulting on anything related to the detox. So as I mentioned, I do have a detoxination program that I do train on, and then also a detoxination certification training. And currently I am doing mostly remote detox coaching with clients around the world. I also do have a 1-hour retainer for advising you on how to do the program. It's $75, and it is billed in 15-minute increments. Now, if you're curious at all about our logo, it is in honor of my father. These are 3 of the planes that he did fly while in the military. So the F-100 Super Sabre represents the saber hook that's on the back of the head of the saber hawk. The Hawker Hunter represents the hawk's beak. The talons are the T-38, and you'll notice that the talons have the caduceus by the neck, because we want to lift up the medical world into a better detox format, because this is the foundation for any health and wellness program. You have to remove the barriers to good health, and that involves environmental toxicants. And as you'll notice, the wings are chemtrails, because they are real, folks. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it, and I hope that you've learned something today. Feel free to reach out to me, and as you'll see in the description of this video, there is a link to heal.me/detox, and that's how you can actually schedule a time with me so that I can help you to make some life-changing decisions like saunas and whether or not this program is right for you, because there are preclusions and contraindications. Anyway, all the best.